sentence you to 10 years in Florida State Prison. That will be followed by 6 years of reporting probation. In the unlawful use of a two-way communication device, that's a second-degree felony, the maximum exposure.
YNW Melly's double murder trial has reached its breaking point. Accused of killing his own friends, Melly collapsed in court when YNW Bortlen, once his brother in music, turned state witness. Betrayal, forensics, and raw courtroom drama collided in a moment that could define the entire trial. Melly, born Jamel Demons, faces charges for the 2018 murders of Anthony Williams, YNW Sack Chaser, and Christopher Thomas Jr., YNW Juvie. Prosecutors claim Melly and Cortland Henry, aka YNW Bortlen, staged the crime scene to look like a drive-by, when in reality, the shots came from inside their own Jeep. The case gained national attention, not only because of Melly's fame, but also due to its shocking details: surveillance footage, cell tower data, ballistics evidence, and testimony from insiders tied to the YNW collective. The prosecution's theory centers on motive and collaboration, saying Melly pulled the trigger over crew tensions and money disputes, while Bortlen drove and helped cover it up. Melly's defense argues the opposite, insisting the killings were the result of a random drive-by by unknown shooters. But everything changed in 2023, when Bortlen's cooperation and testimony pushed the trial into its most dramatic phase yet.
He went on trial, which ended in a mistrial after a hung jury. And despite facing 2 charges of capital murder, the defense is still pushing for bond and offering a number of compromises if the judge allows it.
Cortland Henry, better known as YNW Bortlen, was first charged as an accessory after the fact. But after striking a plea deal, he flipped, becoming the prosecution's star witness. His decision to testify gave prosecutors exactly what they needed: to connect Melly directly to the murders. From the start, the state planned to use Bortlen's insider perspective to destroy the defense's drive-by theory, and instead paint a story of betrayal within the YNW crew. Melly had held himself together for most of the trial, calm, collected, and composed. But when Bortlen took the stand, everything changed. Witnesses in the courtroom said Melly tensed up, whispered to his lawyers, and eventually slumped forward as if the weight of betrayal had crushed him. Court reporters described it as a collapse, a breaking point, as his former brother detailed the night of the murders. To understand the impact, you have to look at their history. Melly and Bortlen weren't just rap partners, they were family. Both came up out of Gifford, Florida, as founding members of the YNW collective. When Murder on My Mind made Melly a star, Bortlen was right there in the music videos, on tour, and by his side at every move. That brotherhood shattered the moment Henry agreed to cooperate. And when he spoke in court, the details were devastating. Prosecutors said Henry placed Melly in the rear left seat of the Jeep, the exact position forensic reports and ballistic evidence had already pointed to. His testimony aligned perfectly with the state's case and cut the heart out of the defense's argument. Spectators in the courtroom described the moment as chilling. As Bortlen's words echoed, Melly buried his face in his hands, his body leaned forward, and deputies moved in, ready to step between him and the witness. The betrayal hit harder than anything else in this trial. The clip of Melly collapsing spread everywhere online, with fans saying it looked like he was watching his own fate unravel in real time. But this wasn't just about the moment. Prosecutors had a strategy. They knew forensic evidence alone could leave room for doubt. Ballistics are messy, and the defense could easily spin that. But when paired with testimony from someone who was actually in the car, it gave the jury a complete narrative. Legal experts pointed out that insider testimony can be controversial, since deals and reduced sentences create incentives to lie. And the defense jumped all over that. They attacked Henry's credibility, saying he only flipped to save himself. They pressed him on inconsistencies in his past statements, trying to paint him as unreliable. But Bortlen didn't break. He stayed calm, repeated the same key points, and lined his story up with the physical evidence. And that was the problem for Melly, because jurors saw not just data, but a betrayal that felt real. The optics were devastating. Prosecutors managed to put Melly and Bortlen, once brothers, on opposite sides of the courtroom. That collapse became the symbol of loyalty being shattered. Local news ran with it. Commentators said Melly's body language could sway the jury, making it look like even he felt the weight of the testimony. And when you zoom out, the chain of evidence was stacked against him. Surveillance footage from studios and businesses showed Melly with the victims hours before the murders. Phone records put him in constant contact with Bortlen that night. And the so-called drive-by theory fell apart once investigators compared bullet trajectories to the Jeep's angle of entry.
So, Mr. Henry, what it's going to be is 2 counts of accessory after the fact, tampering with a witness in a capital felony, and unlawful use of a two-way communication.
Forensic pathologists confirmed what prosecutors had been saying all along. The victim's wounds showed shots fired from inside the car at close range. And that matched exactly with Bortlen's testimony, where he described Melly as the one pulling the trigger. When the medical findings were read out in court, Melly looked shaken, repeatedly leaning toward his defense team for guidance. It wasn't just the science, it was the psychology. For years, Melly called Bortlen his brother, praising him as family during YNW's rise. Now that same brother was on the stand, describing in detail how Melly allegedly killed his own friends. Legal analysts called it the ultimate betrayal, the kind that cuts deeper because it comes from the inside. Commentators pointed out that jurors often give more weight to testimony when it feels reluctant, especially when it comes from someone who once stood by the accused. In this case, that made Bortlen's words even more powerful. The courtroom itself reacted instantly. Gasps, whispers, tension filling the air. Melly's mother, Jamie Demons, couldn't hold back her distress as her son physically slumped in his chair. Media outlets zoomed in on her emotional reaction, broadcasting the human toll of the moment. Prosecutors doubled down, leaning into the betrayal angle in their arguments. And from that point on, the trial wasn't just about forensics or ballistics anymore. It was about a broken bond. Two men who once shared everything, now tearing each other apart in front of the world. For jurors, the image of Melly collapsing as his brother-turned-witness spoke could weigh just as heavily as the bullet trajectories or phone records. Psychology often sways more than science in courtrooms. And by the end of the day, reporters were already filing stories. Headlines screaming about Melly's collapse and Bortlen's betrayal. The collapse and Bortlen's testimony quickly became the centerpiece of the trial. By the next morning, media coverage wasn't talking about ballistics or forensic jargon. It was locked in on one image: YNW Melly folding in court under the weight of his brother's words. That collapse became symbolic. To the prosecution, it represented loyalty shattering in real time, betrayal amplified by science and broadcast to the world. From that moment, the trial shifted. It was no longer framed as some complicated forensic puzzle. It became a betrayal saga, with prosecutors painting Melly as the trigger man and Bortlen as the insider finally telling the truth. Analysts compared it to other high-profile cases where co-defendants flipped, pointing out that jurors rarely ignore insider accounts when they line up with hard evidence, and that's exactly what prosecutors pushed. They reminded the jury that ballistics had already ruled out a drive-by. Experts testified the bullet trajectories and residue patterns could only come from inside the Jeep, specifically from the left rear passenger seat, the very spot where Melly sat. Cell tower data backed it up too, tracing Melly's phone before, during, and after the murders as Bortlen sped the victims to the ER. Piece by piece, the state built a narrative where Bortlen's words weren't standing alone, they were being confirmed at every turn. For the jury, betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was evidence.
For the person who sees the situation as one where I submit to the court on totality of circumstance, they will pass.
Defense counsel counterattacked. With vigor framing Bortlen as a self-serving informant motivated by leniency, they argued that his plea deal distorted his incentive structure, essentially forcing him to implicate Melly to secure reduced sentencing. Defense attorneys pointed to inconsistencies in Henry's prior statements, including early police interviews in which he described the shootings as a drive-by. By contrasting those accounts with his present testimony, they aimed to show a pattern of narrative shifting. According to court transcripts, however, prosecutors anticipated this tactic and preemptively acknowledged those inconsistencies, presenting them as the evolution of truth under mounting evidence. Observers noted that jurors remained attentive but unreadable. Some took notes, others fixed on the witnesses. In cases of this magnitude, the jury's perception often becomes as important as the testimony itself. Studies on courtroom psychology revealed that jurors weigh credibility based not only on words but also on demeanor. The defense attempted to restore equilibrium by introducing expert witnesses of their own. A forensic pathologist testified that while the victim's wounds were consistent with shots from within the Jeep, alternative interpretations could not be entirely ruled out. They suggested the possibility of ricochets or complex trajectories influenced by the chaotic environment. But prosecutors dismantled these alternatives during cross-examination, pressing the witness to admit that probabilities overwhelmingly favored the state's version. Coverage of these exchanges emphasized how defense experts struggled to provide a coherent alternative theory that matched both the wounds and ballistic patterns. Melly's legal team also leaned heavily on the absence of direct physical evidence linking him to the weapon. No DNA or fingerprints on shell casings tied him definitively to the shots. They argued that without such proof, Henry's testimony remained circumstantial. Prosecutors responded by pointing out that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, particularly in a chaotic crime scene where multiple individuals handled the vehicle.
The defendant is in a room. He is confronted by the police that they don't believe what he's telling them. That he's lying to them and they have to come clean. And then he's not Mirandized. He's surrounded by a bunch of police. He goes to the bathroom. He has police taking him to the bathroom. He's in a room where...
Jurors were reminded that Henry himself admitted to being present, but placed Melly as the shooter. The psychological toll on Melly deepened as proceedings dragged on. Courtroom sketches and reports showed him alternating between head-in-hands postures and blank stares. His family's visible distress, particularly his mother's frequent tears, added emotional weight to the spectacle. Reporters noted that at several recesses, Melly required extended consultations with his defense team before regaining composure. In closing arguments for that phase, they subtly referenced truths too heavy to bear, implying that Melly's reaction stemmed not from emotional strain, but from an internal acknowledgement of guilt. While legally they could not present his collapse as evidence, their phrasing left jurors with the impression that reactions matter. The media amplified this framing. Mainstream coverage described the testimony as shattering for Melly, with headlines portraying him as undone by betrayal. Social media further magnified the narrative, with viral clips of his collapse spreading across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Comment sections debated whether his breakdown signaled guilt or the pain of being accused by a former friend. Either interpretation fueled the prosecution's advantage. One painted him as guilty, the other as unstable under pressure. Neither perspective favored acquittal. The defense responded by shifting the narrative towards systemic bias. They argued that prosecutors unfairly targeted Melly because of his fame and lyrical content. Songs like "Murder on My Mind," though recorded prior to the killings, were repeatedly invoked by the state to imply predisposition. Defense attorneys insisted this was prejudicial, noting that artistic expression does not equate to confession. Legal analysts highlighted that courts often grapple with whether rap lyrics can be admitted as evidence. Scholarly studies confirmed that jurors exposed to violent lyrics are more likely to associate defendants with criminal behavior, even absent corroborating proof. Despite these objections, the state framed Melly's lyrics not as direct confessions, but as illustrations of mindset and thematic preoccupation with violence. The judge allowed limited references, balancing artistic freedom with prosecutorial relevance. This created yet another psychological hurdle for Melly, whose artistic persona blurred dangerously with the prosecution's narrative of reality. Meanwhile, the betrayal theme deepened. Prosecutors called additional witnesses tied to the YNW circle, some offering partial corroborations of Henry's account. Text message records were presented, including exchanges in which group members discussed tensions, money disputes, and loyalty, while none explicitly confirmed the murders. The tone of these communications added context to the prosecution's portrayal of internal conflict. Forensic data confirmed timestamps aligned with Henry's version of events, further strengthening credibility. Public reaction mirrored courtroom intensity. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered, some wearing YNW merchandise, others holding signs declaring Melly's innocence. Counter-protesters highlighted the victims, demanding justice for Sackchaser and Juvie. The split underscored how the trial transcended legal boundaries, evolving into a cultural flashpoint. National outlets reported on the polarization, noting that hip-hop communities debated whether Melly was being targeted unfairly or held accountable appropriately. Inside, the prosecution sharpened their focus on Henry's reliability. They emphasized that while he benefited from a plea, his testimony exposed him to potential retaliation and public scorn, suggesting that fabricating such a narrative would only worsen his position. By casting Henry as reluctantly truthful, they invited jurors to view his account as painful but necessary. Legal psychologists explained that jurors often sympathize with reluctant witnesses, perceiving them as more trustworthy than those appearing eager.
In other words, the deal you negotiated is the deal you negotiated, and that's the ball. You understand all that, sir?
Even as forensic experts returned to technical details, jurors carried the image of Melly breaking under his friend's words. In high-stakes trials, these images often overshadow minutiae. Courtroom reporting confirmed that journalists consistently referenced the collapse in their daily recaps, ensuring the narrative dominated public memory. As weeks passed, the defense adopted a strategy of attrition, lengthen proceedings, introduce alternative theories, and hoped to erode juror certainty. Filed motions for mistrial, objected to perceived prosecutorial misconduct, and challenged evidentiary rulings. Each motion was denied, but the filings served to preserve grounds for appeal. Legal filings revealed a defense intent on fighting every inch, aware that even if convicted, appeals might succeed on procedural grounds. The toll on Melly intensified. Reports described his health declining with visible weight loss and fatigue. Observers noted he often appeared disengaged, staring blankly into space. The collapse during Bortlen's testimony seemed to mark the beginning of this deterioration, a visual reminder of how betrayal can corrode not only legal standing, but physical resilience. In cultural discourse, comparisons emerged with other artists whose inner circles turned against them under legal pressure. Commentators recalled historic betrayals in hip-hop, framing Melly's case as part of a larger narrative of fame colliding with loyalty. Parallels amplified coverage, situating his collapse within a broader saga of music, crime, and downfall. The second phase of trial proceedings concluded with the sense that momentum had shifted irreversibly. Prosecutors had not only secured damning testimony, but also reshaped the trial's atmosphere. The defense's counter-narratives, while persistent, struggled against the weight of corroboration. Betrayal story had taken root, symbolized in one unforgettable image, a young star collapsing in open court as the person once closest to him described a night of death and deception. Verdict of betrayal. The final stage of the trial unfolded under the shadow of YNW Bortlen's testimony. The image of YNW Melly collapsing remained seared into the proceedings, shaping how jurors, media, and the public perceived everything that followed. Prosecution and defense each recognized the symbolic weight of that moment and recalibrated their strategies accordingly. For the state, it was a visual representation of guilt. For the defense, it was the crushing weight of betrayal and falsehood. The prosecution opened its closing sequence by returning to the physical evidence. Ballistics experts had already testified that entry angles were consistent with internal shots, and the state reinforced that Henry's testimony merely explained what the science had already revealed. Cell phone data was highlighted once more. Records indicated continuous communication between Melly and Henry, even as the Jeep was later discovered at an emergency room with the victims. Forensic telecom analysis established timelines that mirrored Henry's testimony almost exactly. The state presented this as airtight corroboration. Henry was not creating a story. Devices told the same story in cold, unalterable data. The defense countered with renewed attacks on Henry's credibility. They emphasized his incentives, the plea agreement, and the inconsistencies between his initial interviews and current testimony. Counsel reminded jurors that accomplished testimony requires caution under the law, citing jury instruction precedents. They argued that without physical evidence tying Melly to the weapon, the state's case was built on a foundation of self-preserving betrayal.